Okay, welcome back everyone. We now come to the second of 3 conversations titled Responses. Please post any questions and comments you have to the chat box and we'll come back to them in the Q&A. Oka and Annabel, back to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I hope everyone had a good break. We first discussed crises and now we're going to discuss the responses to those crises. The response to intersecting crises in the media in the UK and mainstream media internationally has largely involved the erasure of disabled and chronically ill people from the conversation about the pandemic. So firstly, we need to acknowledge the appropriation of illness narratives. What's really triggering and quite traumatizing for our communities is that issues that we had been campaigning for, as I mentioned, lifetimes, and trying to get into the conversation were wholly ignored for such a long time. And now that illness is literally at the forefront of everyone's minds, we're not even being included in the conversation. There's no acknowledgement that we do have a rich history of scholarship and of creation in response to this, that we have developed methods for survival that could benefit everyone. It's really quite amazing and awful how, for instance, when universities switched to online learning, not many universities and arts institutions or online exhibitions, as you will, actually consulted with disabled and chronically ill people about how we had been doing this for, since the beginning of the internet, right? Disabled people had been asking, how do we make things actually accessible? And contrary to popular opinion, it's not just about putting everything online and that's a quick fix. As Annabel said, there's so many disabled people who are non-users of the internet. And in addition to that, there are people such as Amy Hamray. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing their name right. It's A-I-M-E, first name, H-A-M-R-A-I-E. Second name will include a link to their directive for accessible teaching and learning in the COVID-19 environment with the other materials. But they, have really developed how to teach and learn in a way that is accessible. It's not about just putting things online. For a lot of people who are chronically ill, like both of us, we do require comfort breaks. We do require, there are people of different neurodivergent identities who require different things, who need to be included in the conversation. And there is an art to this. There is a craft to this that has been developed. There is a way to do accessible conference making that it has been pioneered by, in the States, Black disabled women who have been doing, whose method for making accessible conferences is often copied, rarely cited, right, as intellectual labor. It's not just, once again, in terms of extractivism, it's always expected that we as disabled and chronically ill artists, researchers are asked to give solutions, right, provide solutions, and that we will do this out of the goodness of our heart. We don't need to be cited or compensated. This has been going on our whole lives, right? And the fact that it's either A, not going on at all, or B, going on with such a, in such an exploitative way at a period when a genocide of our people is not even being acknowledged, and is continuing to be perpetuated. Whenever I see, or hear about the new normal, I think about how incredibly ableist this response is as a response to the crisis. Because invariably, when I hear whether government ads or corporate ads, or just general conversation about the new normal, quote unquote, it does not have any conception of how we are suffering as communities now as disabled and chronically ill people. And it makes me feel as though, people will think we're out of the crisis when non-disabled people are out of the crisis. But we as disabled and chronically ill people, who are the largest minority of the world, who comprise, I think, Annabel, we had a conversation, like 22% of the UK. This is not a niche, it's not a niche market. This is 22% of the UK. Have been decimated, continue to be endangered, and to really just be treated in such terrible ways, and to have illness discussed in ways that are really ableist, because people often, if you're steeped in this, pervasive capitalist ableism, you don't have the vocabulary to speak about illness in a way that is, you know, in accordance with ethics. You don't have the knowledge and the tools, and you think that everyone is starting from zero, right? As though, oh my gosh, we don't know what to do. This is unprecedented, which, by the way, it wasn't, because obviously, as Native Americans can tell you, pandemics and eugenics have gone together and have been happening for quite a long time. So, you know, responses in art schools that don't cite existing disability-led scholarship and activism, especially Black and majority world disabled women and non-binary led scholarship and activism, people who have pioneered accessible teaching and learning in conferences, you know, really needs to be reconsidered. In Indonesia, as with in the UK and elsewhere, there's been a really inadequate and inconsistent government response, but also some really wonderful artist-led mutual aid initiatives. We're talking, I joined, during the pandemic beginnings, I joined a Zoom call led by Jatiwangi Art Factory, which is this wonderful village-based, community-led residency program that I did in Indonesia. And the, you know, people participating in the Zoom came from all over internationally, and it was wonderful to see initiatives like MES 56 in Yogyakarta. You know, it's an artist space, and people were asking, what are you doing for artists during this pandemic? They were like, we are literally feeding artists. That artist space became a place, sort of like a soup kitchen, where artists could go breakfast, lunch, and dinner to eat literal starving artists, right, during this pandemic. And that's when you talk about how is art going to continue, what is the continuance of the art world, that needs to be linked to the survival of artists' body minds and the actual survival of artists, many of whom are disabled and chronically ill, not responses that exacerbate eugenics, as is currently the case.
I think eugenics is a really important concept here. I've personally seen a lot of responses that are eugenicist and eco-fascist. Mm-hmm. You know, these kind of narratives of humans are the virus, you know, these myths of overpopulation that fail to analyse, you know, global consumption, emissions patterns as colonial in and of themselves. You know, we see racist health outcomes happen in real time. You know, in the UK, there is an increased probability for Black people, especially, and people of colour, to contract COVID-19 and to fall critically ill with it. It's a combination of racist housing, employment, as well as healthcare systems. When we see in real time the UK government's avoidant response to the overwhelming body of evidence for institutional racism impacting on outcomes for COVID-19 for different groups of the population. You know, we saw do not resuscitate forms sent to learning disabled people and older people, which really just provokes the question of, you know, whose lives are deemed worthy? Mm-hmm. Who's deemed worthy of having their life saved? And how are these measures of worthiness embedded into COVID-19 narratives so seamlessly? This whole time, you know, I read Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine probably between 5 and 7 years ago, a long time ago. And I'm really thinking about it at the moment in terms of how crisis is exploited to establish controversial and violent policies.
Like herd immunity, quote unquote, which was
herd immunity. Mm-hmm. It, you know, it comes in the same breath as eugenics. This idea, you know, that there's a certain amount of death that is acceptable because it's of weaker people in the population. It's eugenics. Yeah, so thinking about how crises are exploited in terms of the shock that the population is in. You know, citizens are distracted and overwhelmed by COVID-19 as a crisis, you know, emotionally and physically, and thinking about how they're unable then, how we become collectively unable to engage and develop adequate responses to eugenics as perpetuated by states, and how, you know, how can we resist effectively when we're in a collective state of shock?
Right. And I think the response from art schools is generally to sort of have this sort of blanket idea that the we are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic is non-disabled people, right? And for disabled and chronically ill people, the reaction there, because it's not disability led, which again is like, it's so important. I really don't think people understand this enough. Any response has to be disability led. And we see, you know, we've talked about this, we see commissions and we see initiatives about illness and isolation being given to non-disabled artists and non-disabled initiatives and non-disabled organizations, when, you know, for decades, these disabled and chronically ill communities have been asking for funding, have been asking for respect, have been asking for wider, you know, dissemination of ideas and propositions and very detailed understandings of body, minds, and illness and what that does to the arts, right? And it's really shocking. It's completely shocking that people who have been forced to isolate for, you know, I'm not saying it's not hard, but honestly, for months as compared to lifetimes, right? And you have to imagine the people who have been mocked for taking photos with masks on, like our colleague Alice Wong, you know, in the States, right? Who have to wear masks, were mocked for taking photos with masks on, and now it's become a trend. You know, all of us who have been, you know, sidelined for, oh, they talk about disability too much, they're the disability person, they talk about illness too much, sidelined. And now, during a global pandemic, you know, that conversation is taken up by completely ableist narratives and people who don't understand that they're perpetuating those completely ableist narratives and eugenicist narratives. So I think it's really, I don't think people understand enough how we're feeling within our communities to have this happen to us on a global scale.
I think as well about how invisible some of that work becomes. Like, you know,
and to whom?
Oh, totally. You know, I think about, you know, I'm a member of UAL's Disabled and Neurodiverse Staff Network. And I'm going to drop a link into the chat that I think is really interesting for this, because a lot of people since the onset of COVID-19 have been talking about the impact of it on memory and concentration, essentially, you know, in the area of what's called executive function in the medical field. You know, as a neurodivergent person, this is the exact experience that I've had to mitigate against for all of my life, thinking about how, you know, work, education, the whole of society is structured to take place in a very linear fashion, to have very able normative assumptions about our ability to navigate, you know, the structures of society. And suddenly a lot of people are experiencing a lot of, you know, the ways of their minds working that mine has always worked this way. And so I find myself doing a lot of, well, voluntary work to support my peers, to you know, support my non-disabled peers, you know, people in my life who've never experienced this once, and all of a sudden it's like, you have so much knowledge, and I think, well, yeah, I do.
Yeah, we do. And I think you and I were both speaking about how, you know, all of a sudden, although there have been many responses that were not adequate, the responses that were helpful, such as, you know, the ability to work from home for people who, like us, you know, have issues of who are neurodivergent and or disabled and are chronically ill, were at the drop of a hat in a matter of days, because non-disabled people were affected. These policies were enacted. And I don't think people understand enough that the lack of these policies that we have been asking for, we've literally been severely injured by these policies not being given to us. I really don't think people understand that we have been physically harmed and injured by lack of access. I think people are just like, oh, it's okay, I'm so sorry, I didn't know, you know, oh, all of this. And it's really, now that non-disabled people understand how vital these policies are, now it's being enacted. And that in itself is pretty traumatic. You can look up the hashtag accessibility for ableds if you'd like to really delve into how angry our communities are about this.
Yeah,
this was available all along.
It should have been available all along, but then you think about how legal frameworks, you know, in the context of education and employment, you know, we're talking about art schools. You know, I'm thinking about the parameters of the Equality Act 2010, you know, the piece of legislation that introduced this idea of quote unquote reasonable adjustments. And I think about how, you know, prior to COVID-19, if anyone like me or like Oka were requesting adjustments to the way that we work, imagine we're requesting flexible working or remote working, for example, two kind of key factors in the current crisis that have had to change for the large portions of the workforce, those requests would be measured against able normative ideas of reasonableness. Yes. Like standards of reasonableness that prioritize business need over individuals, Absolutely. Over the health and safety of individuals, right? And now all of a sudden it's like a moment of feeling like I've been gaslighted for however many years straight, because all of a sudden the request that I'd been making for adjustments and all of this kind of fuss over how reasonable it is or unreasonable, how reasonable or unreasonable I am in existing in the way that I do and trying to access my workplace. So all of a sudden, there's no need for such gatekeeping around access.
Yeah, it's painful. It's painful, and it is gaslighting. It's institutional gaslighting across the board, across all art schools that's going on, and
wider society.
And wider society, and it really is. Also, I think this sort of discounting of our prior scholarship and contributions goes along with the charity model of disability a lot when it is enacted. And that's also very problematic, right? To see us as sort of a population that needs taken care of, that needs to be taken care of. Thank you all for listening to part 2. And we hope you join us again for the wrap up, part 3.